older clip. This is not associated with the main show. However, a lot of you will not like what I have to say here, and that's okay. And I invite you 100% to come on the show later on this evening and to tell me why I'm wrong or whatever. But I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about why Trump is losing right now. And he is. He's losing right now. He's losing pretty badly right now. Not to the numbers of like a blue tsunami or a blue wave, like many people in the media would have you believe, but he is losing by his own actions. And I want to talk about that here. So where we find ourselves at this moment in time at about 3 p.m. on November 5th is there is still a lot of the race left to go, but it could be determined by the end of the day. Biden is currently sitting at 264 electoral votes. If you look at most polls, they give him Arizona. Arizona is where we're finding ourselves seeing a pretty big upset there, as well as Nevada. You have people from the Trump campaign coming out claiming that there is voter fraud, incomplete ballots or inappropriate ballots, that there's some kind of grand conspiracy that's happening. You're seeing this pop up across the board in regards to Michigan and Wisconsin. Both of those have been absolutely debunked multiple times. I'm not going to go over it again and again and again. It's just that they've been debunked. I'm sorry if you don't believe it. Google it. You will find it. There it is. But when asked about the voter fraud in Arizona and in Nevada, specifically Nevada, where Matt Schlapp and other members of the Trump team are currently filing lawsuits about the count, they can't provide any evidence. When pressed by multiple people to provide any kind of evidence, they cannot provide any kind of evidence. That's not to say they don't have the evidence, but the optics of it look really bad. It's mostly just a PR tactic to keep the Trump supporters thinking that they're winning, but they're being screwed over, when in reality, they're not winning, and this is just the voting process. So allow me to quickly just kind of run you through what happens. And I'm going to use a very odd metaphor as we get to the end of this, but this is legitimately how things are going. And I do want you to take a quick listen here. So I want you to imagine a pendulum. And the pendulum is the voting public. Okay, so before the election, you had Trump very much out there for months trying to discredit mail-in voting, discredit all of that stuff, claim election fraud, election rigging, all of these things that he's still out there today on Twitter saying. He's been saying it for months, laying the groundwork for this type of grand conspiracy to take hold and to permeate in the minds of his supporters. He did this with intent, and it worked, all things considered. The QAnon people out there that he claims to not know anything about, which is an absolute fallacy, they're the ones right now that are running with this in ways that is just borderline lunacy in many aspects. And so here's what we know. When there was a push by the states to encourage mail-in voting and early voting because of social distancing, because of the pandemic, we saw a massive, massive, massive increase. And this is where the beginning of the pendulum takes us. So let's kind of just move it to the left, because everyone, including the polls, were saying Biden is going to knock it out of the park in a landslide. A lot of people believed it. They've been proven wrong. And honestly, at this point, pollsters probably need to find a new career. Nate Silver, I'm looking at you. So we start off there. Okay. But here's how the numbers break down. You had 40 million people do in or early voting. 40 million people voted early at polling stations in their respective states and cities. Excellent. Awesome. I love it. Then you had over 61 million people do early mail-in voting, or just mail-in voting. 60 million people. In a country of 330 million, that is a significant amount of people. They voted early via mail-in ballots. So here's how this then works. So we have the pendulum to the left, because most people thought that those mail-in ballots were going to be heavily Democratic, in which case they are, more so in many cases. That pendulum then starts on the left. We have the early numbers going into election day, showing Biden with a lead in many cases, simply because of everything, because of the early voting. Now, here's where Trump's plan came into play, and this is what he had attempted to do, but he failed at. Ultimately, he told everyone, don't go and mail in ballots. Don't go and do any of the early voting. Come out on election day and surge the polls. Red mirage, whatever you want to call it, red tsunami, whatever. This is what he pushed for. And people did it. His followers did it. And so the whole intent behind that was in order to have such a massive, massive first day push that what it would do is it would overtake the early voters in person, and it would then show Trump as having a massive electoral lead. In fact, they were believing that it was going to be about 280 electoral votes at the end of the day on Tuesday. At that point, what it would do is more or less put Biden in a position to concede, almost forcing him to concede, because by their idea, their logic, that there would be no pathway forward. That's not what happened. It was a good plan. Ultimately, their plan was to kind of impregnate America, right? They timed it up just right. And they wanted to try to impregnate America with one big push. The problem is, though, they weren't really expecting plan B. And that, of course, is when the pendulum shifts back towards the left from the right. This is where the mail-in ballots are coming into play. And this is why so many people are not understanding why we find ourselves where we find ourselves, and why Biden is simply a couple of hours away from most likely securing 270 electoral votes and therefore ending the contest entirely. Whether it's through Nevada, which he's currently in the lead at a growing margin, or whether or not it's Pennsylvania, which he's closing in on Trump. Now, yesterday morning, just to be fair, yesterday morning, there was a 700,000 vote difference in Pennsylvania. That number has now dwindled to less than 95,000, with still 12, or I think with 8% of the vote left to go, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple 100,000 votes, which could easily, given the fact that, again, and I'll talk about that here in a second, all these blue votes, these Democratic votes that are coming in through the mail-in ballots, could easily swing the state towards Biden. And honestly, at this point, it's looking like that is a very high probability. Let me explain why that's happening. What's going on here is you had the Democrats come out and do early voting. And so the Republicans believed that the Democrats had expended all of their capital, right? That the Democrats had expended everything that they were going to do, that they were going to show their hand, and that because of the numbers that were going to be available, then the Republicans would be able to then come on in and just overtake those numbers with that red mirage or that red wave in hopes of just crushing everything. Except they didn't take into consideration the one thing they probably should have: the mail-in ballots. Now, like I said, Trump had been for a long time trying to discredit these. We know about the slowdown at the USPS. There's a lot of other issues that went into this whole situation. And especially right now with 300,000 votes across 10 states, the USPS failed to deliver on time to be counted. I mean, that's an issue. There's a lot of issues here. However, going back to that point, when you look at the idea of the 61 million votes that have come in through mail-in ballots, that then requires people to count them. That's going to take time to count 60 million. Trump wanted this thing over in one day. Why? Because he wanted that groundswell of support to crush the competition and force their hand to concede. He didn't want you thinking about the mail-in ballots, and he didn't want you thinking about what would be coming next, which is why he's been trying to invalidate them for so long. Those 60 million people are now being counted in these states. They weren't allowed to count until Election Day in many of these states. Florida was able to start their count ahead of time, which is why we got more of an accurate representation for Florida. But when it comes to everything else, like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, New Mexico, or Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, all of these states have had that happen now. And as we start seeing these votes being counted, right, these ballots that were cast by American citizens being counted, we're starting to see that number tighten. We're starting to see that Biden number rise. And this is why Trump is losing. His plan was all about a swift and concise defeat on election night. When it came out that neither party was going to concede that night and that we were not going to get a winner on election night, at that point, Trump knew he was done, which is why he has been as erratic as he has been and why this whole thing is playing out in the way that it currently is. Now, this may not be something that you want to hear. And there will be a lot of people in the comment section attempting to claim that there is voter fraud and that there's all this other stuff that's going on. The truth of the matter is, it's not happening in the way that you think. There have been a couple cases of mail-in voter fraud. Republicans. One man voted on behalf of his dead mother. There are people out there that are trying to willfully use bad optics to discredit the concept of mail-in voting, therefore discrediting people who have voted legally in this country, all because they do not want Donald Trump to lose. There is a reason this is happening. Right-wing media, right-wing pundits that are trying to tell you otherwise right now, they're lying to you because they are trying to cope and get a handle on this loss that they did not think was going to happen. And since most of these people make a lot of money off of all of this, they are absolutely financially incentivized to continue the grift and to continue lying to you. You may not like what I have to say, but everything I am saying today is backed up by fact. Everything that I'm saying today is backed up by fact. And I'm not talking about 4chan. I'm not talking about Discord leaks. I'm not talking about someone who is doctoring information or finding false information, or in one of the cases in regards to, I think it was Wisconsin, and the amount of registered voters that was making its way around to say that Wisconsin was lying and cheating. They pulled 2018 election data, not 2020 census data, which they're still in the process of counting. How do I know that? Well, for one, I legitimately just ended my job as an enumerator for the 2020 census here in the state of Washington. So I am aware of how the process works. That is my fact in the situation. You are being lied to and deceived by people if you believe this nonsense that's going on. The plan was always to win on election night. They failed. And when they failed that, their bid for the presidency more or less went up in smoke. Now we have to wait for the numbers to come in. And of course, as always, the recounts to happen. But the truth of the matter is this: Donald Trump will demand recounts in at least Georgia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Although in Michigan, he won't be able to because the percentage is too high. At that point, he has to pay for those recounts, which means he's going to go to you, the Trump supporter, for money because his campaign is effectively broke. This is what has been happening with Trump. He has been actively attempting to undermine the election for a swift win or a very, very, very messy defeat. And the last thing he wants to do right now is lose because, well, quite frankly, his entire world will come crumbling down once he leaves the White House. This is a reality as well. You can take my word for it or not take my word for it. As always, you guys can call into the show tonight and tell me I'm wrong or agree with me, whatever you want to do. That's open. We have call-ins open all the time. Boulder Talk Radio around 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time tonight. It will be on the air. Look for the link, subscribe, like the video if you want. You probably won't, and that's okay. I'll talk to you all later. Have yourself a great day. Thank you again for watching, and talk to you tonight. Bye.